What do you do when your own professor tries to destroy you? He mocked me in class, failed my papers, told me I wasn't cut out for academia. But I refused to stay silent. I gathered every piece of proof. And when karma finally struck, it was his career that shattered, not mine. I still remember the first day I walked into Professor Harris's lecture hall. It was my second year in college, and I'd been excited for his class. Everyone said he was strict but brilliant, someone who could sharpen your mind if you could survive his high standards. I walked in with my notebook ready, sat in the front row, eager to prove myself. What I didn't know was that this man would become the shadow that almost ruined my future. From the beginning, something felt off. His eyes lingered too long when I answered questions, not with interest, but with annoyance. When I volunteered an idea, he cut me off mid-sentence, waving his hand as if my thoughts were irrelevant. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe he was just tough on everyone. But slowly, I began to notice a pattern. He praised others even when their answers were half-baked. Yet when I spoke with confidence, he found a way to twist my words to make me look foolish. The class would laugh softly and I would sit there, heat rising in my cheeks, pretending I didn't care. But inside, I felt the sting. Assignments came next. I worked hard, harder than ever before. I pulled late nights, cross-checking research, polishing arguments. But when the grades came back, my papers were marked with red ink, slashed apart with comments that felt more like personal jabs than constructive feedback. Unclear, poor logic, weak effort. Weak effort? I had poured myself into those pages. My friends in the class compared their work with mine. Some admitted mine was stronger, more detailed. Yet their grades were higher. It didn't make sense, unless it wasn't about the work at all. I started to feel a quiet hostility building between us. It was in the way he would smirk when handing my papers back, the way he avoided calling on me unless it was to challenge me. Once, when I corrected a mistake he made on a formula, he didn't thank me. He glared, his jaw tightening, and then for the rest of the lecture, he ignored me completely. That was when it clicked. This wasn't about my ability, it was about him. He didn't like me for reasons I couldn't understand. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was that I refused to sit quietly in the back like so many others. Whatever it was, his dislike was no longer subtle. It was growing into something sharp, something dangerous. The final confirmation came during a group project. My team performed well. We worked like a machine, every part fitting together. When the grades were announced, everyone else got an A. I got a C. My teammates stared at me in shock, whispering that it had to be a mistake. But when I approached him afterward, he simply smiled and said, "Sometimes effort is not enough." It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about grades. He wanted me to fail. Have you ever felt unfairly judged by a teacher? After that group project, I stopped pretending it was in my head. The pattern was too clear. Professor Harris had chosen me as his target. Every time I entered the lecture hall, I felt his eyes on me, sharp and cold, waiting for me to stumble. The others seemed to sense it too. Some whispered that he was unfair, but most kept their distance. No one wanted his attention turned on them. I tried to ignore him at first. I told myself I'd just study harder, polish every assignment, leave no room for him to attack. But it didn't matter. Even when I submitted flawless work, he found ways to chip at it. If I wrote 10 pages of analysis, he'd say it was excessive. If I kept it concise, he'd call it shallow. There was no right answer, not for me. One day he gave us a surprise quiz. I knew the material inside out. I was the first to finish, confident in every answer. When the results came back, I had failed. I checked the paper carefully. My answers were correct. Every one. Yet he had marked them wrong. I felt my hands shaking as I stared at the paper. After class, I confronted him. My voice trembled, but I held his gaze. "These answers are right. Why did you fail me?" He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "Maybe in your opinion, they're right. But this is my class, my standards." The way he said my standards made my stomach twist. It wasn't about knowledge, it was about control. He wanted me to know he could bend reality to his will, that my hard work meant nothing if he decided it didn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the humiliation, the smug tone in his voice. I thought of my GPA, my scholarship, the future I was building. If he kept this up, he could destroy all of it. And I realized something terrifying. He wanted to. It only grew worse. In class, he'd throw questions at me out of nowhere, obscure ones, trying to catch me off guard. If I answered correctly, he'd dismiss it as lucky. If I hesitated for a second, he'd cut me off and say, "As I thought, unprepared." The others would glance at me with pity, but no one spoke up. My friends outside the class told me to report him, but I was afraid. He was respected by the faculty, feared by the students. I worried they wouldn't believe me, and if he found out I had complained, what would he do then? So I stayed quiet. I kept showing up, swallowing the anger, scribbling notes while he looked for ways to make me stumble. I felt like I was carrying a weight every day, heavy and relentless. And then came the midterm, the exam that would decide half our grade. I studied until my eyes burned, certain I could not afford a single mistake. When the results were posted, my heart dropped. He had given me a failing grade, not borderline, not barely scraping by, a flat-out fail. The same exam my study partner had passed easily, the same answers marked correct on her paper were marked wrong on mine. That was the moment the fear turned into something else. It turned into fire. Do you think professors sometimes let personal bias cloud their judgment? The midterm was supposed to be the breaking point, but instead it lit something inside me. I wasn't going to let him push me down quietly. I had worked too hard for this degree, sacrificed too much to let one bitter professor decide my worth. At first, I thought about storming into his office and demanding an explanation, but I knew that would only give him what he wanted. He thrived on confrontation, on watching me lose control. No, I needed to be smarter. If he was going to play dirty, then I would gather proof. I started small. I borrowed my study partner's exam paper and laid it side by side with mine. Identical answers, word for word in some cases, yet hers marked correct, while mine bled with red ink. I photographed everything, careful to capture the handwriting, the markings, the date. Then I dug out past assignments. Again and again, I found examples where my work had been judged unfairly compared to others. I built a folder of evidence, each piece like a brick in a wall, preparing for the day I would confront him not with anger, but with undeniable truth. But evidence alone wasn't enough. I needed witnesses, so I started talking quietly with classmates, asking if they had noticed the way he treated me. Some admitted they had. One girl whispered that she'd seen him smirk whenever he called on me. Another said she'd caught him marking my paper with barely a glance. I asked them if they'd be willing to speak up. Most hesitated, too afraid, but a few nodded, saying if it came to it, they'd back me. For the first time, I felt less alone. Still, Harris must have sensed something shifting because he doubled down. He piled on extra criticism, sneered when I spoke, even hinted in front of the whole class that some students were not cut out for higher learning. His eyes had flicked toward me as he said it. The message was clear, but instead of shrinking under his words, I sat taller. Every jab he threw only made me more determined. I could see the surprise flicker across his face sometimes when I didn't crumble, when I met his stare with steady eyes. He wasn't used to resistance. The turning point came during a presentation. He interrupted me halfway through, claiming my data was flawed. I calmly pulled out the official source in front of everyone and read the figures aloud. The class went silent. For the first time, he had no comeback. He forced a thin smile and moved on, but I could see the anger tightening his jaw. After class, a few students came up to me quietly. "You were right," one said. He was wrong. Their words were small, but they felt like a victory. I knew then that I had a chance. If I played this carefully, if I held my ground and gathered enough proof, I could expose him for what he was. And maybe, just maybe, I could turn his cruelty back on him. What's worse, being treated unfairly by a stranger or by someone in power? The weeks after the presentation were tense like a storm building on the horizon. I could feel the hostility in every lecture. Professor Harris no longer even tried to hide it. His voice grew sharper when addressing me, his eyes colder, his tone dripping with disdain. It was as if my small victory had burned his pride, and now he was determined to crush me completely. The pressure weighed on me day and night. I would sit in my dorm staring at textbooks, but the words blurred. Sleep slipped away from me and food lost its taste. Every time I thought of walking into his class, my stomach twisted. But still I went. I forced myself into that room, because if I gave up now, he would win. The breaking point came with the final project proposal. Each student had to submit a detailed outline of their chosen topic. I stayed up for nights drafting mine, cross-checking sources, polishing arguments until it was airtight. I walked into class that morning, exhausted but confident, ready to hand over something I knew was strong. When Harris called my name, I stepped forward, passed him the folder, and waited. He flipped through the pages for less than a minute before closing it. His eyes met mine, and I knew something cruel was coming. "This is unacceptable," he said flatly. The room went still. I felt every eye on me. Unfocused, shallow, lacking originality. I expected more. His words were measured, deliberate, like knives pressed one by one against my skin. I wanted to protest, to demand he actually read it, but the lump in my throat held me back. Instead, I just stood there, heat rising in my face, humiliation spreading through me like fire. When I sat down, my hands trembled. I stared at the desk, trying not to cry. That was when I realized he wasn't just trying to lower my grade. He was trying to break me as a person, to humiliate me until I quit. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the folder still in my bag. His words echoed again and again. Unacceptable, shallow, weak. My chest ached like I had swallowed stones. But then I thought of the evidence I'd gathered, the photos, the comparisons, the whispers from classmates who had seen his bias. I thought of the presentation where I'd proved him wrong in front of everyone. And slowly the ache turned into something else. Resolve. He wanted me broken, but instead he had pushed me into a corner where I had no choice but to fight harder. If he wanted a war, then I would not hide anymore. I pulled the folder out, flipped through the pages, and knew it was good work. Not perfect maybe, but strong, solid, worthy of a fair grade. His judgment was not truth, only spite. And for the first time I allowed myself to imagine the day when all his cruelty would come back to him, when karma would balance the scales. I didn't know when or how, but I knew one thing for certain. It was coming. If a professor abused their authority, would you report them? After that night, something inside me shifted. I stopped waiting for Harris to be fair. I stopped hoping he might see my effort. Instead, I focused on building the case that would one day expose him. I spent hours in the library not just studying for his class, but studying him. I collected every graded assignment I had and laid them out in careful rows, comparing them with friends' papers. Time and time again, the truth revealed itself. Identical answers marked differently. Strong essays labeled weak. Careful research ignored while sloppy work was praised. I photographed everything, naming files, organizing them into folders. Each piece was a small spark. Together, they were a fire waiting to ignite. I also began journaling every interaction, the date, the time, the words he used when he singled me out in class. Unfocused, unprepared, not cut out for this. Words that cut, words that stayed, words I would not let vanish into memory. Written down, they became evidence, not just feelings. A few classmates started opening up more. One boy admitted quietly that Harris had told him he graded me more harshly because I was too confident. Another said he overheard him muttering after class that I needed to be taught humility. My chest tightened with anger, but I thanked them and wrote it all down. Each voice mattered. The hardest part was keeping calm in his class. Every day I walked in, I felt his eyes waiting for me, daring me to slip. He tried again and again to provoke me, to make me lash out in front of everyone. But I smiled, took notes, kept my tone even. Inside I was burning, but outside I was composed. And the calmer I stayed, the more frustrated he seemed to grow. I started visiting the student advocacy office too. At first I only asked questions, general ones. What happens if a professor is biased? How do you prove unfair grading? What is the process? They gave me pamphlets, guidelines, advice. I didn't file a complaint yet, but I was laying the groundwork, making sure I understood the path. Nights were long and heavy, but instead of feeling helpless, I began to feel prepared, like I was gathering armor piece by piece. My grades still suffered under his hand, but I no longer saw them as verdicts. They were just more proof of his spite. One evening, as I packed my bag after class, I caught Harris watching me. His smile was thin, almost satisfied, like he thought I was finally breaking. He had no idea that every mark of red ink, every sneer, every dismissal was only sharpening my resolve. I left the building that night under the glow of campus lights, my folder heavy with evidence. For the first time in months, I felt a strange calm. He thought he held all the power. But the truth was, with every step I took, I was taking it back. Do you believe karma always finds people who abuse power? By the time mid-semester turned into late semester, Professor Harris's arrogance had swollen like a balloon stretched too thin. He believed he had me cornered. Every class he grew bolder in the way he mocked my answers or dismissed my efforts. It was no longer subtle. It was a performance meant to entertain himself and remind me who held the red pen. But arrogance has a way of making people careless. One afternoon during a lecture, he handed back our essays. I unfolded mine carefully, and there it was again, a failing grade. His comments scribbled across the margins, calling my work incoherent. I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest, but instead of snapping, I stayed quiet, calm. After class, I lingered while students filed out. He looked at me with that smug little smirk and said, "If this continues, you may want to consider another path. Academia is not for everyone." I smiled back, steady and slow. "I'll keep that in mind, Professor." The flicker in his eyes told me he hadn't expected that. He wanted anger, tears, surrender. Instead, he got composure. That was when I knew he was slipping. He was so sure he was breaking me that he couldn't see I was already tightening the noose of evidence around him. A week later came his biggest mistake. He assigned a short analysis paper. My study partner and I decided to swap drafts before submission, just to double-check our work. After revising, we submitted separately. Our papers were nearly identical in structure, argument, and references. When the grades came back, she had received an A. I had failed. This time, I didn't just photograph the papers. I walked straight to the library scanner and made official copies, time-stamped and logged. The difference in treatment was undeniable. 2 students, same work, different outcomes. His bias was no longer suspicion. It was fact. I also caught him contradicting himself. In class, he praised one student's idea as innovative. A week earlier, I had made the same argument in my essay, and he called it weak and derivative. I noted the dates, the quotes, the grading. Piece by piece, his arrogance built the very case that would undo him, but I still kept quiet. I let him believe he was in control. I nodded in class, handed in my assignments, took his jabs, all the while I was preparing. And then karma gave me an unexpected gift, an overheard conversation. One evening, as I packed my bag in the lecture hall, I heard Harris talking to another professor near the doorway. He laughed, low and sharp, and said, "Some students need to be put in their place. Confidence can be dangerous." My heart stopped. He wasn't even hiding it. He was admitting it aloud. I wrote down every word the moment I left. Another stone added to the wall. What he didn't realize was that his arrogance had stopped being my burden. It had become his trap. Should students fight injustice even if it risks their grades? There comes a point when silence stops feeling like strength and starts feeling like surrender. I had carried his cruelty quietly for months, building my wall of proof, but with each fresh humiliation, I felt the pressure inside me mounting. The day finally came when silence was no longer an option. It was after another lecture. Another red-inked paper returned with the word weak scrawled across the top. I sat staring at it long after class ended. My hands were steady, but my chest thudded with anger. I knew my work was solid. I knew his judgment was not truth, but spite. And this time, instead of bottling it up, I walked straight to the student advocacy office. I laid the folder on the desk and said simply, "I think my professor is targeting me." The counselor looked at me carefully, asked me to explain. For over an hour I spoke, unfolding months of notes, photographs, testimonies, even the copy of identical papers graded differently. Their eyes grew wider with each piece I laid out. When I finished, they leaned back slowly and said, "You've documented everything?" "Yes," I replied, my voice calm. "Everything." They explained the process. Formal complaints required review panels, documented evidence, potential interviews. They warned me it would not be easy. Professors had tenure, reputation, authority. But when they asked if I wanted to proceed, I heard my own voice say, steady and certain, "Yes." The days that followed were heavy. I knew word might reach him. I knew the risk. But for the first time, I also felt lighter. The silence had broken. My voice was in the system now, no longer just whispers in my head or notes in my journal. And then something unexpected happened. A few classmates, hearing whispers that I had filed a report, came to me quietly. One girl admitted she had seen him mark me wrong on a question she had answered identically. Another boy said he always noticed how Harris cut me off while letting others ramble. They didn't want to be named, but they wanted me to know I wasn't imagining it. Their support gave me courage. I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself, but for anyone who had ever been crushed under unfair power and told to stay quiet. Harris must have sensed the shift. In class, his jabs grew sharper, almost desperate. He slammed a book shut when I answered correctly, dismissed my points with a laugh too loud, as if trying to reassert control. But instead of shrinking, I sat straighter, my notes neat, my face calm. Inside, I was no longer afraid. I was waiting for the moment when all his arrogance, all his cruelty, all his spite would be laid bare before more than just me, waiting for karma to finally arrive. Have you ever seen someone powerful finally get what they deserve? There comes a point when silence stops feeling like strength and starts feeling like surrender. I had carried his cruelty quietly for months, building my wall of proof, but with each fresh humiliation, I felt the pressure inside me mounting. The day finally came when silence was no longer an option. It was after another lecture. Another red-inked paper returned with the word weak scrawled across the top. I sat staring at it long after class ended. My hands were steady, but my chest thudded with anger. I knew my work was solid. I knew his judgment was not truth, but spite. And this time, instead of bottling it up, I walked straight to the student advocacy office. I laid the folder on the desk and said simply, "I think my professor is targeting me." The counselor looked at me carefully, asked me to explain. For over an hour I spoke, unfolding months of notes, photographs, testimonies, even the copy of identical papers graded differently. Their eyes grew wider with each piece I laid out. When I finished, they leaned back slowly and said, You've documented everything? Yes, I replied, my voice calm. Everything. They explained the process. Formal complaints required review panels, documented evidence, potential interviews. They warned me it would not be easy. Professors had tenure, reputation, authority. But when they asked if I wanted to proceed, I heard my own voice say, steady and certain, yes. The days that followed were heavy. I knew word might reach him. I knew the risk. But for the first time, I also felt lighter. The silence had broken. My voice was in the system now, no longer just whispers in my head or notes in my journal. And then something unexpected happened. A few classmates, hearing whispers that I had filed a report, came to me quietly. One girl admitted she had seen him mark me wrong on a question she had answered identically. Another boy said he always noticed how Harris cut me off while letting others ramble. They didn't want to be named, but they wanted me to know I wasn't imagining it. Their support gave me courage. I realized I wasn't just fighting for myself, but for anyone who had ever been crushed under unfair power and told to stay quiet. Harris must have sensed the shift. In class, his jabs grew sharper, almost desperate. He slammed a book shut when I answered correctly, dismissed my points with a laugh too loud, as if trying to reassert control. But instead of shrinking, I sat straighter, my notes neat, my face calm. Inside, I was no longer afraid. I was waiting for the moment when all his arrogance, all his cruelty, all his spite would be laid bare before more than just me, waiting for karma to finally arrive. Have you ever seen someone powerful finally get what they deserve? The email arrived on a gray morning when the sky hung heavy with rain. My phone buzzed beside me as I stirred sugar into my coffee. I glanced at the screen, saw the subject line, outcome of review panel. For a moment, I just stared. The spoon paused midair, my breath caught between dread and hope. Then I opened it. The words blurred at first, but slowly sharpened into meaning. The panel had found clear evidence of bias and unprofessional conduct. My grades in his course would be reevaluated by an independent professor. Formal disciplinary action would be taken against Harris. I set the phone down, my hand trembling. It was over. The weight I had carried for months lifted all at once, leaving me dizzy, light, almost unsteady. I'd braced myself for doubt, for dismissal, for the possibility that nothing would change. But karma, patient and steady, had finally moved. News spread quickly through the department. Students whispered in hallways, their eyes bright with surprise, some with relief. I wasn't the only one who had felt his cruelty, only the one who had dared to challenge it. And now that challenge had cracked his armor for everyone to see. In class, his fall was visible. The sharp authority in his voice had dulled. His posture hunched slightly, his gaze no longer daring but defensive. He moved through lectures like a man walking through a storm, soaked and shivering, trying to pretend he wasn't cold. The day they announced his temporary suspension, the classroom buzzed before he even entered. When he did, silence fell heavy. He looked older somehow, smaller, his arrogance stripped bare. For the first time, his eyes met mine without that familiar smirk. There was no victory in his stare, only something close to fear. He mumbled through the lecture, papers shaking slightly in his hands. When it ended, he dismissed us quickly, his voice low. I lingered for a moment, watching as he stuffed notes into his bag, shoulders slumped. This was the man who had tried to break me, who had called me weak, shallow, unworthy. Now he looked broken himself. I walked out into the corridor where students whispered around me. Some smiled, some nodded subtly in support. I realized then that this fight had never been mine alone. My voice had become the crack in the wall, but the pressure behind it had been building for years through countless others who had suffered in silence. That night, I lay in bed listening to the rain against my window. For the first time in months, I felt peace. The marks on my papers, the cruel words, the humiliation, they no longer mattered. What mattered was that truth had spoken louder, and karma had answered. Would you forgive someone who tried to ruin your future? The semester ended with a quiet sense of closure I had not expected. My grades were reviewed by an independent professor and came back higher, fair, reflective of the effort I had poured into every page. Seeing those numbers on the final transcript felt like breathing clean air after months trapped underground. Professor Harris did not return the following term. Word spread that his suspension had stretched longer than expected, that his file now carried a mark impossible to erase. Some said he might resign altogether. I did not celebrate his downfall. I did not need to. His fate was his own making, the result of choices repeated again and again until they finally caught up to him. Walking across campus in the spring sunlight, I noticed things I had missed before. The sound of laughter drifting from benches, the warmth of the grass underfoot, the freedom of walking into class without a knot in my stomach. My mind was no longer tangled in fear or anger. It was focused on the future I'd almost lost but refused to surrender. Friends who had watched silently from the sidelines began speaking more openly. Some confessed they had faced similar treatment but never dared to resist. They told me my fight had given them courage. At first I didn't know how to respond, but slowly I understood. My battle had been personal, yes, but it had also been a reminder that silence only protects the one who harms, never the one who suffers. One afternoon I returned to the library where so many nights I had sat hunched over papers, eyes burning with exhaustion and fury. I opened my journal, the one filled with every cruel remark and every wound turned into evidence. I read the first entry again. He wants to break me. I smiled softly. He hadn't. Instead, he had shaped me into something stronger, sharper, more resilient than I ever thought I could be. The girl who once trembled at his words was gone. In her place stood someone who had faced down injustice and spoken until she was heard. I closed the journal and tucked it away, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof of growth. That evening, as the campus bell rang across the courtyard, I whispered to myself, full circle. Life had tested me through the cruelty of one man, but in the end, it wasn't his power that defined me. It was my refusal to surrender. It was the truth that cut through lies. It was karma, steady and unyielding, finding its way back to him. And as I walked toward the horizon of my next chapter, I carried no bitterness, only the certainty that no matter what battles lay ahead, I had already learned the most important lesson. I could not be broken. Do you think karma is real or just coincidence?